So I almost finished about talking about the requirements for approval, but I will say a little bit about mandatory metadata as well, because originally we didn't have, or for many years we didn't have any required metadata at all. We felt that records creators should use the metadata that they need, and the job of the archive is not to tell government how to perform its business. Our job is to keep evidence of how government performed its business. However, we realized that after a while things began to evolve, and government authorities stopped using files, for instance, so they just had documents, and they said, well, you can always find your document using free text search and stuff like that. So we thought that it was getting a little bit out of hand. So we introduced some mandatory metadata, and I will tell you in a while what they are. But the main thing for us in terms of not setting up a full metadata scheme that they have to comply with is that we say you will always transfer or submit all your metadata to the National Archives. Many countries around the world, the archives, they have a very specific metadata scheme that you have to follow. But when you then submit your documents to the archives, you submit the documents and only the mandatory metadata. So we felt it was better to have very, very few basic metadata and then have a setup where you submit all your metadata to the archives. So here they are very, very basic, as I said. For files, they must have a unique ID, a title, and a classification according to a file plan, usually based on subjects. And documents must have a unique ID, a title, a date, a sender or recipient if it's a letter, and a registration of which file it belongs to. So very basic requirements, and we actually thought that they would go without saying, but they didn't. So we had to say this is how you do as a minimum. In terms of notification, I should also say a few words about the evolving concept of a system, because we ask authorities to notify us on new systems. And one thing that people often say to us is, well, how do we define a system? We have service-oriented architecture, and we have loosely coupled systems. We have all sorts of things going on right now. We have made the regulation so that it is possible to define a unit as a system, even if it's not a database and an application, which usually was the definition of a system. So it is possible for the records creator to say we have information that is dealt with in what is like a virtual system, even if it's not in one database. And I don't think we see this very often, but we have the possibility, and we have thought a lot about this. And this may be an area where we will see our regulations will have to be improved over the years. So we are watching closely what is happening with the authorities in this respect. So when we come to the setup for submission of data, we are beginning to talk about the next pillar in our strategy, and that is, of course, the migration to archival formats at the time of transfer and frequent submissions of the migrated content to the National Archives. So when it's time to submit data to us, and that is usually every 5 years, as we defined when the system was notified to us, or we were notified about the system. So at that time, we initiate a meeting with the records creator so that we can talk about the submission more in detail. We discuss the selection of tables, we discuss what documentation must be submitted together with data and documents, and we discuss a timetable. The actual production of submission information packages must be done by the records creator. They can do it themselves, or they can hire a consultant to do so, or they can use the company that sold them the system originally. We don't really care, but the main point is they have the responsibility for the production of the submission information package. Obviously, that is not always popular with the records creators, but we feel it's important to stress that they have the responsibilities for what kind of systems they use, how much effort they put into quality assurance, how well they work with their records management procedures and documentation. And this is actually an incentive for them to work with their records management procedures, because they know that if they have good records management procedures, often it will be easier to submit a well-documented archive to us. So there's this incentive to improve the quality of the way they work with the systems when they have the responsibility for paying for the submission themselves. If you use the system for 5 years, then you have the first submission of data. That doesn't mean that you delete the data in the system. Of course, if the records creator still needs the information, it will remain in the system. So you have a situation where you have an archived copy of data while those records may still be in use. And this is also one of the paradigm shifts compared to the way we dealt with paper records, because if you have a paper record, it can only be either with the records creator or at the National Archives. But in the digital world, it doesn't matter. What we get is a copy for archival purposes, and it's perfectly fine that the records still remain with the records creator as long as they need it for their daily businesses. We have a very specific standard for the way data should be submitted to us. So a standard for the structure and the content, the formats and the documentation in the submission information package. And it's all described in an executive order. And that executive order has been translated into Icelandic, as far as I know. So, and I think the content is pretty much the same. At the core is that we have data in a relational form. Obviously, we've chosen the relational form because that's the most standardized and widely used way to store data, and it makes it easy for us to make standardized tools to test, preserve, and make data available again. Data from the tables from the IT system is exported as XML files in a format that we call SIAD. SIAD stands for System Independent Archiving of Relational Databases. And it's actually originally a format that was developed by our colleagues in Switzerland. And we wanted to implement it in Denmark because we knew that XML was the right way to go. And there was really no reason why we should begin to reinvent a format that had already been made by the Swiss. And what is even more exciting, after we implemented this standard in Denmark, we had a meeting with representatives from a lot of places in Europe, and we realized that it would be possible to make a common XML-based preservation format for relational databases. There was an XML-based format in Portugal as well. So that was the beginning of a project called eArch, a European project that works on defining requirements for submission information packages, archive information packages, and dissemination information packages based on the SIAD format and the Danish implementation of it. So hopefully within, I don't know, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, or maybe even before that, we have something that looks like a common European standard for database preservation. So that would be wonderful, and I think also good for you because you have already started using the SIAD format up here as well. Documents from IT system must be migrated to a few document formats. We have TIFF as the main document format. We also have JPEG 2000 for photographs and pictures and drawings. For sound, we have MP3, and for video, we have MPEG-2 and MPEG-4, and we have GML according to an ISO standard for geographical information or data from geographical information systems. We also have requirements for standardized documentation. We have some things that should also always be included in the archival or the submission information package, and of course a standardized structure, which I will show you here. So the structure of a submission information package looks pretty much like this. You have an identification of the package, and then you have data from the tables in a folder, and you have, if it's a system with documents, the documents in a folder. You also have a folder with context documentation, and that's one of the really important things for us, that when you export data and documents from an IT system and migrate them to archival formats, it's very, very important that the future user will have some kind of information about how data was created. So in this folder you will find, for instance, a user manual for the original system, or if it's a business system that was used to work with a specific piece of legislation, you would include a TIFF version of that piece of legislation in the context documentation. So the idea is that even if you've taken this information out of the system where it was created, we still keep enough information that the future user can get an idea of how and why was this information originally created. We have chosen English names actually for those files, and that has to do again with the whole SIA thing, that we took names from that standard, and we didn't feel that it was necessary to translate that into Danish, but it gives actually a fun mix between Danish and English in the requirements. I don't really know what to do about that, but in the exchange of ideas within the eArc project, I think that was probably a good thing. In the folder that's called indices, we have an archive index, and in the archive index you find the information that is necessary for the user to, in a structured way, find the data that he or she needs. In the archive index file, you will find information about the records creator, the period of time in which records were created, and also some basic information about the content of the submission information package. We also have an indication of, does this particular submission information package contain personal registration numbers, for instance, because that would be a clue as to will it be possible to use this together with other sets of data that contain that particular information. As of right now, the content from the archive indexes are not searchable in our database for records at the National Archives, but that is of course the plan, and that will be actually super useful, I think, for the users when that information becomes searchable in our archival registration database. In the doc index you have an index of all the documents from the records management system. And the next one should have been called context documentation index. So there's a mistake here, but that's an index of all the documents in the context documentation. And we have a list of all the files in the file index. And in the table index, we have a description of all the tables and all the columns in the system. Now, if you want to use data, they must be reloaded into a database. And of course, it's very important that you have a description of all the tables and all the columns in terms of what they contain. Actually, when we talk about where we see the biggest problems for authorities that submit data to us, it is actually to make sure that there is an adequate description of all the tables and all the columns in the table index. So this is something that our test people work with a lot to make sure that the quality of the table index file is as it should be. As I mentioned, we test all the submissions because usually they are not good enough to comply with all our regulations. So we test all the submissions and we use the test tool that we have developed ourselves, and it's called ADA. I think it originally stood for something, but I can't even remember. So it's the test tool. It is available for download on our website, and it has a lot of users among authorities and their IT vendors, critical users as well. We get a lot of feedback from users for functionality that they want improved in the test tool. Maybe you are among the critical users as well up here. So we are right now working on a development project, so we will get a new and more powerful test tool in the course of 2016. A test tool can obviously only test things as a machine. It can check that the documents have the right formats, that the character set is valid UTF-8, that the XML files are valid and stuff like that. But that is not enough to make sure that the submission actually complies with our regulations. When we start to discuss the submission with the records creator, we talk about the selection of tables and documentation, as I said. And that is specified in a specification for transfer or submission. And that specification is a very, very important thing for our test people, because they take the specifications and say, what did we agree upon? Does this submission contain all the tables that we agreed upon? Does it contain all the documentation that we agreed upon? And surprisingly often, the answer to that question is no, it doesn't. So that's one place to start, is to go through this specification of submission and to make sure that we got exactly what was agreed upon. And then we have the question about documentation. Are all tables and columns documented the right ways? And that is often not the case. And especially when we talk about codes in the data set, you often have codes where you see in a column that it has 1, 1, 3, 3, 2, 2, 4, 4, 1, 1. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 must stand for something, but it's not described what that code actually stands for. So that is also one of the things that we see a lot. We have made a catalog of the most common errors in the submission information packages, hoping that the records creators and their vendors will be so kind as to read that document before they submit data to us and see if some of those errors might be present in their submission before they send it to us. So they can both do the automated test with ADA themselves, and they could also check some of the things that we check during this manual test process. And usually we send submissions back 2 to 3 times before they are okay. But that's on average. So of course we have some really, really good vendors who after a couple of years now have reached a level where we can actually approve of the first submission, and then we have sometimes submissions that goes on forever and ever. And I think the worst example I can think of took 7 years from the first submission to the final approval. And that is also absolutely worst case scenario. Yeah, but sooner or later we will approve of the submissions, and they will go into our preservation system as AIPs, Archive Information Packages. We base our physical preservation on a distributed digital preservation, which means that we have several identical copies of data. In our case, we have 3 copies. This is something that you can always debate. Should it be 2? Should it be 5? We have settled on 3 copies. But here as in so many other questions about digital preservation, there is no one single right answer. There's the answer that you find based on your own risk assessments. So 3 identical copies, and they are independent of each other. We use both optical and magnetic media. So we have 2 copies on magnetic tape and 1 copy on Blu-ray discs. And this is back to the strategy for physical preservation. This is where we are at right now. But way back, we had all our data on magnetic reel tapes. That is not a current technology anymore, so we had to take all the magnetic reel tapes, reload data, and burn CDs. CDs. And for a while, we also kept a copy on hard disk. We have had DVDs. The last DVDs were produced in 2014, 15, yeah, last year maybe. So right now it's magnetic tape and Blu-ray discs, and we know for a fact that within a few years we will have to come up with new solutions. So our answer to the physical preservation issue is to use different types of technology to make sure that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. We say in Danish, I don't know if that works in English, does it? Yeah. Because if something goes wrong with the magnetic media, we still have the optical media and vice versa. And if we have 2, for a while we had 2 copies of DVDs, and we made sure that the copies were stored on different batches, or maybe even different productions. Again, to make sure that there was no single point of failure that could destroy all our copies. We also have several locations, so we have offline storage in 2 locations in Copenhagen, and we have nearline tape storage in Aarhus, in Jylland. That is hosted by our colleagues at the State Library. So we have distributed even not only between different types of technology, but also distributed between 2 organizations. So if somebody goes completely crazy at the National Archives, we still have a copy of data. That copy is, of course, encrypted, because even if we love our colleagues at the State Library dearly, they cannot access our material, of course. So it's encrypted, the copy that we store over there. We have right now about 100 terabytes of born digital records. We estimate that the accession this year will be 40 terabytes. If we go back to the printer that I talked about at the beginning, that would probably equal around 40 kilometers. I think 40 shell kilometers of records. And the number is just going up and up and up. So we are working hard to figure out how can we continuously expand our capacity so that we can always store the information that we got in a securely way. And then on top of that, we have, of course, 170 to 200 terabytes of digitized records that we also need to find a permanent storage solution for. So we still have a lot of things to think about and to work with in our digital preservation. One of the problematic things about our strategy is that it doesn't say anything about access at all, I think. Because I have to admit that I wrote the drafts for it, and in my world, even though I always talk about how things should be kept so it can be used, in my world, things actually end here with the physical preservation. Things are stored and kept, I'm happy. But we need to talk about access as well, because again, we don't keep information just to keep it, we keep information so that people can use it. And we have developed a system to search in our submission or our archive information packages, and we call it SOFIA, and that stands for Search and Find in Information Packages. It works better in Danish. Søg og find i arkiveringsversioner. And we have both a module that works with records management systems, and we have a module that works with business systems. Now, the idea in dividing between records management systems and business systems is, of course, that we know what kind of standard information we can find in a records management system, also based on the mandatory information that we require. So we know that if it's a records management system, there is a case file, and the case file has a title, and there are some documents. The documents have a title and a date and a sender and a recipient and all that. So we have made a system that works for all kinds of records management systems because we know sort of what kind of information we can find there. For the business systems, it's a completely different situation because that could be anything from 500 tables from the tax authorities to one table from, I don't know, something else. So here we have to load data into the system and then try to figure out exactly what kind of information the user wants to find. So where we have a very high usability in the SOFIA system for records management systems, we have a much lower usability for all the business systems because it's so difficult to standardize something that is so diverse as it is. Just for the fun of it, I brought a few screenshots. This is for the way we search in records management systems. I know the graphic user interface could probably do with some, I don't know, how would you call it? It kind of looks like something that was created in East Berlin before the wall came down. But it doesn't matter because the important thing is that using this module, you can actually search in records management systems. And we use it a lot, of course, because we have so many records management systems that are now so old that data are not still with the authorities. And when the archivists then deal with a situation of transfer of the paper records that was registered in the system, it's always very nice for them to be able to search in SOFIA for that particular information. So that's a standardized interface for the records management systems. Yeah. And you can find a file you're looking for, you can find the document you're looking for, and if it's an electronic or digital document, you can also, of course, see the document in the SOFIA system. So it's very basic, but it works so far. We think that this is an area where we will see a lot of development in the coming years, because up until now, our main focus has been to make sure that we have procedures and regulations in place for everything that happens up until when things are securely stored. But nowadays, more and more information that we have in our collection is digital, and we see, obviously, a growing demand for access to this information. So I think in the coming years, a lot of things will happen on the access part. This is from one of the business systems that we have, where we have a person in our digital preservation group who works with making specific queries so that if you have a specific question to those 500 tables from the tax records or whatever it is, she will help create a query that can find the information that you need. We implemented a few years ago a requirement that the records creators themselves create some queries that will help you find some of the most interesting information in their submission. So this job will be easier and easier the more submissions we have with those predefined SQL queries in them. Back to the strategy, the last pillar in the strategy is the one about preservation planning. Because even if we have a system that works well for now, we always need to keep an open eye for all the technological changes we see in the world around us. At some point, it may not be feasible to keep MP3 sound files. and we need to migrate those MP3 sound files to something else. It could also be, I probably wouldn't say TIFF because I don't think that we have to migrate that soon, but maybe the sound formats or the video formats or whatever. We need to think about when is the right time to migrate, when is the right time to make the next big 40-year migration. Also, in terms of media, that's less terrifying, and we do that continuously, but we need to do that according to some sort of plan. So the preservation planning part of our work has much to do with the fact that we know this is an active process, and we need to plan ahead to try to figure out when it's the right things to do some of those preservation actions. We also need to look at the way the use of IT evolves in government, because if we have a set of standards that work well when we develop them, they may not work well in 2025 or 2030 when government uses completely different IT systems, and the gap between the formats and standards that we have for submission and the content that is actually created out there, if that gap becomes too wide, then we will have to do something about it. So preservation planning has something to do with our internal planning, but it also has something to do with the way we look at the world around us. This last dot, I think, is really difficult, because it's really difficult in a busy, everyday work environment to find time to see what goes on out there. So we're always looking for partners in terms of technology watch, etc. And that's why we have become part of a European group called the Open Planets Foundation that does some of this for us and others. Every year we publish a publication called Digital Preservation Status and Knowledge, Digital bevaring status og viden, and you can find that on our webpage, where we try to sum up some of the information that we have found and some of the considerations that we do in that respect. Yes. Almost there. There's one more thing I should say, and that is the conclusion. And the conclusion is that I think we have a solution that works for now. We can see that using the regulations that we do, that has secured millions of documents and also data content from thousands of databases. That will enable future historians and other researchers to tell the story about Denmark in the late 20th and early 21st century. But the strict conversion or migration of data to this limited number of formats, it always raises questions about, do we really keep all information? Do we keep all the significant properties of the content that is created out there? And we know that we don't keep all the significant properties. So we have to have an open mind in that respect and see, will international cooperation, for instance, lead us to new formats that can preserve information just as well in terms of preservation safety, but even better in terms of the content. This is something that we work with, as I said, in the EARC project and through the Open Planets Foundation. And we are very happy that Iceland is also sort of on board, because we work together on our standards. So what happens in that international cooperation will probably also have its effect up here. So what can I say other than we have exciting years ahead of us?